upon him. "See, she is awake," he cried. "The danger is overpast." Hollis echoed, his voice thick and unnatural. "You say the danger is overpast? I am awake, good doctor. I have not by chance fallen asleep at my post and come to dream this thing. You are awake, man, and I repeat the danger is at an end. Now go and rest." Wondering to whom it was the doctor spoke, whose was that raucous, weary voice that questioned him. She slowly turned her head and beheld a gaunt, hollow-eyed ghost of a man whose pallid, sunken cheeks were overgrown with a coarse stubble of unshaven beard, standing between the bedposts, clutching at one of them as if for support. Meeting her gaze, he recoiled a step and loosed his hold. Then he swung half round, a hand to his brow. "Naught ails me, doctor," he mumbled, and now she knew who he was and remembered. "I would sooner—" His voice abruptly ceased in mid-period. He reeled, steadied himself for an instant, and then toppled slowly forward and crashed at full length upon the floor. Instantly Mrs. Dallows, with a little outcry of alarm, was on her knees beside him. She turned him over, raised his head by an effort, and pillowed it in her lap as Dr. Beamish came hastening up. The same thought was in the mind of both nurse and physician. Nancy sought painfully, for she was very weak, to raise herself, that she might see what was taking place there on the floor, beyond the foot of the bed. Swiftly the doctor tore open the breast of the colonel's doublet, but not even so much was necessary. At once he perceived what had happened. It was as if the assurance that she was out of danger, and so no longer in need of his ministrations, had snapped the reins of will by which Hollis had held his lassitude in subjection. Instantly nature had claimed from him the dues which he had so long withheld. "He is asleep," said Dr. Beamish, and he almost chuckled. "That is all. Help me to lift him to that couch, Mrs. Dallows. No need to carry him farther, or to do more for him at present. Never fear. You'll not rouse him, not until the clock has gone round once, at least." They laid him there, a pillow under his head, and Beamish returned to his patient's side. She had sunk back again, but her eyes, looking enormous now in her wasted cheeks, were still upon the figure of Hollis where he lay inert as stone, just within the orbit of her vision. "Sleep?" she questioned the doctor, wonderingly. "Is that sleep?" Never had she, nor indeed have many, seen slumber fell a man as if he had been shot. Nothing worse, ma'am. The colonel has never so much as closed his eyes for a whole week. Nature compassionately has closed them for him. No need to afflict yourself on his behalf. Sleep is all he now requires. So give yourself peace, and beware of making demands upon the little strength that's left you. She looked at him intently. "I have the plague, have I not?" "Say rather that you had it, ma'am. You have it no longer. It has been cast out of you. It has left you feeble. But that is all that ails you at present. And you are a safe woman now. When you shall have recovered your strength, you may go whither you will without further fear of the infection. The plague will not touch you again. For the great mercy thus vouchsafed you, you may render thanks to God, and next to God, to your husband." She frowned, perplexed. "My husband?" "Your husband, ma'am. And a husband in 1,000, nay, in 10,000. I have seen many a husband lately, and I speak with knowledge. Alas, the terror of the pestilence can blot out every other feeling. I have seen it happen time and again. But Colonel Hollis is not of those. His is a devotion that makes a hero of him, and because he has been fearless, he has been spared. Fortune favors the brave, ma'am. But he is not my husband." "Not your husband?" said the doctor, confounded, and he repeated, "Not your husband." Then, with an affectation of cynicism very alien in reality to the genial, kindly little man, "Gad, so!" he ejaculated. "Perhaps that explains it. But what is he, then, who has all but given his life for you?" She hesitated, at a loss how to define their relationship. At last, "Once he was my friend," she answered. "Once." The physician raised his bushy brows. "And when, pray, did he cease to be your friend? This man who stayed with you in this infected house, we might have fled. This man who has denied himself sleep or rest of any kind in all these days, that he might be ever a hand against your need of him. This man who has wrestled with death for you, and rescued you at the risk of taking the pestilence 1,000 times for your sake. Did he do all this?" she asked. Dr. Beamish entertained her with the details of the heroism and self-sacrifice that Hollis had displayed. When the tale was done, and she lay silent and very thoughtful, the doctor permitted himself a slyly humorous smile. "He may once have been your friend, as you say," he concluded, smiling. "But I cannot think that he was ever more your friend than now. God, send me such a friend in my own need." She made no response, but continued very still and thoughtful for a while, staring up at the carved canopy of this great strange bed, her face a blank mask in which the little doctor sought in vain for a clue to the riddle of the relations of those two. Had he yielded to his inquisitiveness, he would have questioned her, but, other considerations apart, he was restrained by thought for her condition. Nourishment and rest were to be prescribed, and it was not for him, by probing questions, to prove himself perhaps a disturber of the latter. Chapter 23, The Walls of Pride. That evening Dr. Beamish returned, bringing with him, as on the occasion of his first visit, a public examiner. This official came to assure himself formally of the doctor's assertion that a cure had been effected, so that he might make his report thereupon, to the end that after the lapse of 28 days, provided that in the meanwhile there were no fresh outbreak of pestilence in either of the other inmates, the reopening of the house should be permitted. Hollis, awakening from 11 hours of uninterrupted lethargic sleep, but still heavy with lassitude, stood dully a hand whilst the examiner held his formal inquisition into conditions of the patient, of Mrs. Dallows, and of Hollis himself. As the colonel stood there, gaunt, pale, unshaven, and disheveled, Nancy's eyes considered him very gravely, whilst he himself dared to turn never so much as a single glance in her direction. When the examiner and the doctor passed at last from the room, Hollis dragged himself wearily after them. He followed them below stairs, and remained there alone after they had taken their departure. For 28 days he was doomed to imprisonment in this house, and he made his dispositions. That night he slept in a back bedroom on the ground floor. In the morning, having prepared himself breakfast in the kitchen, a matter in which Mrs. Dallows came to his assistance, he went to straighten out the dining room so that it might serve him for a lodging during the period of incarceration that lay ahead. He found the room in utter darkness. It had not been entered since the night of Nancy's coming thither. He groped his way across to the shutters, which he remembered to have closed by request of the examiner after carrying Nancy from the room on that terrible night a week ago. He pulled them open and let in a flood of daylight upon a scene, each detail of which reminded him poignantly of the happenings of that night. There lay the chair overturned by Nancy as she retreated before Buckingham. He imagined the circumstances in which it had fallen. There on the polished blocks of the floor under the table, where it had escaped the eyes of Dr. Beamish, gleamed the blade of his own broken sword, and yonder in a corner, whither it rolled, the hilt which his nerveless fingers had relinquished when he was struck down. On the floor by the table there was a dull brown patch which he knew to have been made by his own blood, and there were similar stains on the daybed and on the naper of the table, which he guessed had been made by the blood of Buckingham. Fallen between the daybed and the window, he found the slender dress rapier which Buckingham had used. The Duke had dropped it there when he rose at the end of their grim struggle, and he had not paused to recover it in his precipitate flight. For the rest, guttered candles, withered flowers, and rotting fruits encumbered the table, and the luster of glass and silver was dulled by a film of dust. On the sideboard stood the array of dainty dishes that had been prepared for that infamous intimate supper which had never been consumed, rotting there, and loading the atmosphere of the room with the evil odor of decay, which to Hollis was like an exhalation of the ugly memories they held for him. He flung the windows wide, and spent some time in setting the room to rights, and ridding it of all that refuse. Thereafter he lay on the daybed, smoking and thinking, and very listless. And it was thus, in the days that followed, that most of his hours were spent. If he did not regard himself as actually dead already, at least he regarded himself as one whose life was ended, one whom death would bring a welcome relieving rest. Vaguely he hoped. He would have prayed, but that he had long since lost the habit of prayer, that the infection which he supposed present in this house might claim him for her victim. Morning and evening and ever and anon throughout the day, he would open his doublet to finger his breast and explore his armpits in expectancy, eager to discover upon himself the tokens of the plague. But the irony that had ever pursued him thwarted now his desire of death as it had thwarted his every desire concerned with life. Living and moving in that house of pestilence, breathing its mephitic atmosphere, he yet remained as immune as if he had been a safe man. For the first 3 days his existence was one of completest, listless idleness. There were books in the house, but he had no desire to read. He was content to lie there smoking and moping. Each morning Mrs. Dallows reported to him the condition of the patient, which was one of steady improvement, and this was confirmed by the doctor, who paid 2 visits in the course of those 3 days. On the second of those occasions he remained some time in talk with Hollis, giving him news of the dreadful state of things outside. Whitehall was empty now of all its courtly tenants, with the single exception of the Duke of Albemarle. Honest George Monk had elected to remain undaunted at his post as the representative of his king, to perform in the king's name, and whilst his majesty was busy at Salisbury with the amorous pursuit of Miss Frances Stuart, all that which a king himself should be at hand to perform in time of national stress, to mitigate the tribulations of his subjects. Hopefully Hollis inquired of Beamish if he knew aught of Buckingham. Hopefully, that is, because he was expecting to hear that the Duke was laid low by the infection. Gone with the rest, the doctor informed him. He left town for the north a week ago, aroused to a sudden sense of his duty as Lord Lieutenant of York by the fact that a French lackey in his household was stricken with the plague. He'll be safe enough in York, no doubt. A French lackey? Only a lackey. The colonel's face was overspread with disappointment. The devil watches over his own, he grumbled. A wretched lackey pays for the sins of his master. Well, I suppose there's a God somewhere. Have you no cause to know it, sir, and to give thanks? Beamish reproved him, and Hollis turned away without answering, beyond a sigh and a shrug, which but served to increase the doctor's perplexity over the behavior of the members of this odd household. That all was very far from there was abundantly clear. Acting upon a sudden impulse, Dr. Beamish left the room and mounted the stairs again, for all that his time was short and his patience many. Dismissing Mrs. Dallows upon some trivial errand to the kitchen, he remained closeted for 5 minutes with Miss Sylvester. That was the name by which he knew her, the name by which she had chosen to make herself known to both doctor and nurse. Whether it was as a result of what he said to her in those 5 minutes, or whether other influences were at work, within an hour of the doctor's departure, Hollis was sought by Mrs. Dallows with a message that Miss Sylvester was risen and desired to speak with him. The eyes of that kindly nurse, sharpened by solicitude, saw him turn pale and tremble at the summons. His first impulse was to disregard it, but before making any reply, he took a turn in that wainscoted, somber room. Then, with a sigh of resignation, he announced that he would go. Mrs. Dallows opened the door and held it for him to pass out, tactfully refraining from following him. He was washed and shaven, tolerably dressed, and his long, well-combed, golden-brown hair hung in long, smooth ringlets to the snowy collar which Mrs. Dallows had found time to wash and iron for him. Thus he no longer presented the wild, unkempt appearance that had been his when last Miss Sylvester had seen him. But there was a haggard dejection about the lines of his mouth, a haunting sadness about his eyes that nothing could relieve. He found Miss Sylvester seated by the open window, where he himself had sat throughout the greater part of those 5 days and 6 nights when it so unceasingly watched over her to beat back hungry death from her pillow. She occupied a great chair set for her there by Mrs. Dallows, a rug about her knees. She was very pale and weak, yet her loveliness seemed to draw added charms from her condition. She wore that gown of ivory white in which she had been carried to this evil house, and her chestnut hair had been dressed with care and was intertwined with a thread of pearls. Her long eyes seemed of a darker, deeper blue than usual, perhaps because of the hollows her illness had left about them. And there were other changes in her that in their sum appeared almost to spiritualize her, so that to Hollis she seemed to have recovered something of her lost childhood, of her early youth, and looked less like Sylvia Farquharson, the idolized player, and more like the Nancy Sylvester whom he had known and loved so dearly. Wistfully she looked up at him as he entered. Then away through the open window, into the hot sunlight that scorched the almost empty street. He closed the door, advanced a pace or two, and halted. "You sent for me," he said, "else I should not have ventured to intrude." And he stood now like a groom awaiting orders. A tinge of color crept into her cheeks, when her slender, tapering hands, that in these days had grown almost transparent, plucked nervously at the rug about her knees. Ill at ease as she was, her speech assumed, despite her, a stilted, formal shape. "I sent for you, sir, that I might acknowledge the great debt in which you have placed me, to thank you for your care of me, for your disregard of your own peril in tending me. In short, sir, for my life, which had been lost without you." She looked at him suddenly as she ceased, whereupon he shifted his glance to the sunlight in the open, so as to avoid the unbearable gaze of her eyes that were gleaming like wet sapphires. "You owe me no thanks. No thanks at all," he said, and his voice was almost gruff. "I but sought to undo the evil I had done. That was before the plague came to my rescue. In what you did then, you saw at the risk of your life to make me the only possible amend and to deliver me from the evil man into whose power you had brought me. But the plague, now, it was no fault of yours that I took that. It was already upon me when you brought me hither. No matter for that," said he. "Reparation was due. I owed it to myself. You did not owe it to yourself to risk your life for me. My life, madam, is no great matter. A life misused, misspent, has no great value. It was the least that I could offer." "Perhaps," she answered gently, "but also it was the most, and, as I have said, far more than you owed." "I did not think so, but the matter is not worth contending." He did not help her, persuaded of the scorn that must underline her utterances, however smooth, because conscious that scorn was his only desert. He accepted her words as expressions of a pitying gratitude that offended. He stood before her, overwhelmed by the consciousness of his unworthiness, in a mood of the most abject humility, but unconsciously, without suspecting it, he had empanoplied this humility in pride. His desire, above all, was to withdraw from an interview that could be nothing but a source of pain. But she detained him, persisting in what he accounted her cruel charity. "At least the reparation you have made is a very full one. It would comfort me to hear you say it. 'Cause I believe you," he answered grimly, and would have taken his leave of her on that, but that she stayed him by her interjection. "Why should you not believe me? Why should I be other than sincere in my desire to thank you?" He looked at her at last, and in his eyes she saw some reflection of the pain he was suffering. "Oh, I believe you sincere in that. You wish to thank me. It is natural, I suppose. You thank me, but you despise me. Your gratitude cannot temper your contempt. It is not possible." "Are you so sure?" she asked him gently, and her eyes were very piteous. "Sure? What else can I be? What else is possible? Do I not loathe and despise myself? Am I so unconscious of my own infamy that I should befool myself into the thought that any part of it can escape you?" "Don't," she said. "Ah, don't." But in the sorrow in her face, he read no more than the confirmation of the very thing she was feebly attempting to deny. "Is it worth while to close our eyes to a truth so self-evident?" he cried. "For years I sought you, Nan, a man without a stain upon his name, to find you at last in an hour in which I was so besmirched that I could not bear your eyes upon me. The very act that by a cruel irony of chance brought us together here at last was an act by which I touched the very bottom of the pit of infamy. Then that dreadful night, you regarded me rightly with loathing. Now you regard me with pity because I am loathsome. Out of that pity, out of your charity, you fling me thanks that are not due, since what I have done was done in mitigation of my offense. What more is there to say? If this house were not locked, and I a prisoner here, I should have gone by now. I should have departed in that blessed moment that beamish announced your danger at an end, taking care that our paths should never cross again, that I might never again offend you with the sight of my loathsomeness or the necessity to render thanks for benefits received from unclean hands, that you properly despise. You think that sums all up?" she asked him, sadly incredulous. "It does not. It leaves still something to be said. Indeed, a deal. Spare it me," he begged her passionately. "Out of that same charity that bids you thank me, spare me." Then, more briskly, with a certain finality, he added, "If you have commands from me, madam, I shall be below until this house is reopened, and we can go our separate ways again." He bowed formally and turned away. "Randall," she called to him as he reached the door. He paused, his firm resolve beaten down by that pleading utterance of his name. "Randall, won't you tell me how you came into the position in which I found you here? Won't you tell me that? Won't you let me know all, so that I may judge for myself?" A moment he stood there, white to the lips and trembling, fighting his pride, that pride which was masquerading in the garment of humility, and so deceived him that he suffered it to prevail. "Judge me, madam. upon the evidence you possess. It is sufficient to enable you to do me justice. Nothing that went before, no vicissitudes of my vagrant life, can extenuate the thing you know of me. I am a scoundrel, a loathsomeness, an offense, and you know me to be this. You in whose eyes I would ever have appeared as a man of shining honor. Oh, God, pity me. Don't you see? Don't you see? Her eyes were suddenly aswim in tears. I see that perhaps you judge yourself too hardly. Let me judge for myself. Randall, don't you see that I am ache and forgive? Is my forgiveness nothing to you? It would be all, he answered her. But I could never believe in it. Never. You are ache and forgive. You say, oh, bless, healing words. But why is this? Because you are grateful to me for the life I have helped to save. That is a true source of your pity for my soul's deformity, which is urging you to utter this forgiveness. But behind that gratitude and that forgiveness, there must ever remain the contempt, the loathing of this deformity of mine. It must be so. I know it, or I know nothing. Because of that, he broke off, leaving the sentence there, completing it with a wry smile and a despairing shrug. But she saw neither. She had averted her eyes again, and she was looking straight before her into the sunlight, across to the black-timbered, yellow houses opposite, which were blurred in her sight by tears. Softly he went out and closed the door. She heard him go, and suffered him to do so, making no further attempt to stay him, knowing not what to say to combat his desperate convictions. Heavy-footed, he went down the stairs, back to that room where he had his being, and as he went his thoughts confirmed him. They had met at last, those two, only that they might part again. Their ways could never lie together. Overshadowing their joint lives, there must ever be the loathly memory of that irrevocable thing he had done. Even if he were not the broken vagrant that he was, even if he had anything to offer in life to the woman of his dreams, his action when he played the jackal for Buckingham must render impossible between them any tenderness that should be sincere and unalloyed. He was in a mood from which there was no escape. Pride hemmed his soul about with walls of humility and shame, and there was no issue then save by the door that the plague might open. Yet even the plague refused to stand his friend. Chapter 24 Evasion. The weeks crept on, and August was approaching. Soon now the period of quarantine would be at an end, and the house in Knight Rider Street reopened to liberate its inmates. Yet the passing of time wrought no change in the mood of Hollis. Not once again did he seek to approach Nancy, and not again did she bid him to her presence. He informed himself constantly of her progress, and learnt with satisfaction that she was fast recovering her strength. But Mrs. Dallows, who brought him this daily information, was also at pains to let him know at the same time that there was no recovery in spirits to be observed in her charge. She is very sad and lonely, poor, sweet lady. It would melt your heart to see her, sir. Hollis would gloomily make answer to that oft-reiterated report. And that was all. Mrs. Dallows was not a little afflicted. An affliction in Mrs. Dallows had the effect of heightening her resemblance to a hen. She perceived, of course, that a mystery enshrouded the relations of these two, saw that some obstacle stood between them, holding them apart, to their mutual torment, since obviously they were designed to be lovers, and more than once she sought to force the confidence now of one, now of the other. Her motives, no doubt, were entirely charitable. She was eager to help them, if it were possible, to a better understanding. But her efforts to probe their secret remained unavailing, and she could but sorrow in their sorrow. It was a more grievous and vexatious to her, because the deep concern of each for the other was manifest in the questions each set her daily. Hollis kept to his quarters below stairs, smoking continuously and drinking deeply, too, until he consumed the little store of wine the house contained. Then not even in a penty of the cup remained to assuage his grim despondency. His repeated assertions to himself that his life was lived, that he was a dead man without further business above ground. Thus August found them, and from the watchman he heard incredible stories of London's deepening plight, whilst from the window he nightly beheld the comet in the heavens, that latest portent of menace, the flaming sword of wrath, as the watchman termed it, that was hung above the accursed city, stretching, as it seemed, from Whitehall to the Tower. They were within 3 days of the reopening of the house, when at last one evening Mrs. Dallows came to him trembling with excitement and a little out of breath. Miss Sylvester, sir, bids me say that she will be obliged if you will step upstairs to see her. The message startled him. No, He cried out like a man in panic. Then, controlling himself, he took refuge in postponement that would give him time to think. Say, that if Miss Sylvester will excuse me, not this evening. I am tired. The heat, he vaguely explained. The nurse cocked her head on one side, and her bright little bird-like eyes considered him wistfully. If not this evening, when? Tomorrow morning. Yes, he answered eagerly, thinking only of averting the immediate menace. In the morning. Tell her that I shall wait upon her then. Mrs. Dallows withdrew, leaving him oddly shaken and afraid. It was himself he feared, himself he mistrusted, where once the boy had worshipped. The man now loved with love that heaped up and fed the fires of shame in his soul until they threatened to consume him. At his single interview with Nancy, he had exposed his mind. He had been strong, but he might not be strong again. The gentleness of purpose of which she had allowed him a glimpse, a gentleness born of her cursed gratitude, might lead him yet to play the coward, to give her the full confidence that she invited, and so move her pity, and through pity her full forgiveness. And then, if as might well betide, he should prove so weak as to fling himself at her feet and pour out the tale of his longings, his love, out of her sense of debt, out of her pity and her gratitude, she might take him, this broken derelict of humanity, and so doom herself to be dragged down with him into the kennels where his future lay. There stood a peril of a wrong far worse than that which already had done her, and for which in some measure he had perhaps atoned. And because he could not trust himself to come again into her presence, preserving the silence that his honor demanded, he suffered tortures now at the thought that tomorrow, willy-nilly, he must see her, since it was her wish, and she was strong enough herself to seek him should he still refuse to go. He sat and smoked and thought, resolved that at all costs that interview must not take place. One way there was to avoid it, and definitely to set a term to the menace of it. That was to break out of the sealed house at once without awaiting the expiry of the legal term. It was a desperate way, and it might be attended by gravest consequences to himself. But no other course presented itself, and the consequences mattered nothing after all. The thought became a resolve, and having reached it, he gave his mind peace. This, indeed, and not the pains and risks he had taken to save her from the plague, was reparation. Anon, when she came to consider and weigh his action, she would perceive its true significance and purpose, and the perception might at last blot out the contempt of him, which perforce must be abiding in her soul, however she might seek to overlay it with charity. A thought seized him, and, growing a purpose, exalted him. He sought pen, ink, and paper, drew a chair to the table, and sat down to act upon his inspiration. You have asked, he wrote, opening abruptly thus, to know by what steps I descended to hell of infamy in which you discovered me, and I refrained from answering you lest I should arouse in you a further measure of your blessed, self-deceiving compassion. But now that I am on the point of passing out of your life, now that there is no chance that we should ever meet again, I am moved to tell you all, that thus I may bear away with me the fortifying hope that hereafter you will hold my memory in a pity that shall be free of execration. The tale of the ill fortune that has pursued me begins on a May morning many years ago, when I rode full of hope and eagerness into Charmouth, a youth of some substance and more pride, whose feet were firmly planted upon an honorable road of life. I went to claim you for my own, to lay my little achievement and the assured promise of my greater ones at your dear feet. He rode on into the fading daylight. He lighted candles and rode on with that swift fluency of the man who has a clear tale to tell and the eloquence that comes naturally from a bursting heart. The candles, faintly stirred by the night breeze that came through the open window, burnt down, and great stalactites of wax were hanging from the sconces. Still he wrote without pause. He heard, but did not heed, the changing of the watchman at the door below. Later he heard, but did not heed, the passing of the dead cart with its accompaniment of clanging bell and raucous summons. Once only he paused, to procure and light fresh candles, and then rode on. Not until long after midnight, not until the approach of dawn, did he cease, his task accomplished. He sat back then in his tall chair, and stared straight before him, a man bemused, considering. Thus a while, then from the inner pocket of his doublet, he drew a tasseled yellow glove that was slim and long and sorely rubbed and stained with age. He considered it as it lay there across his palm, and bethought him of that dawn many years ago when it had dropped to him from his lady's casement, and he had set it in his hat, to be worn as a favor. He sighed, and a tear, wrung by the anguish of this renunciation from his hardened, adventurous heart, fell on his hand. Abruptly, then he sat forward, and, snatching up the quill again, he scrawled at fierce speed on the foot of the last of the written sheets. Here is a glove that you bestowed on me in the long ago. I wore it, as your knight wearing his lady's favor in the lists of life, proudly by the right of your gift and my unsullied honor. For years it was an amulet to maintain that honor still unsullied against all trials and temptations. Now that it has failed of this purpose through my own cowardice and unworthiness, you may not wish me to retain it longer. That manuscript, for it is hardly to be termed a letter, still survives. Its faded characters cover some 30 pages of paper that the centuries have tinted yellow. It has been, as you will surmise, in my possession. It has supplied me with more than the mere elements of this history, which without it could never have been written. He did not read it through when it was done. There was no time for that. As he had poured it from his heart, so he left it. He folded the sheets together, enclosing the glove within them, wrapped a thread of silk about the package, and on the knot of this he made a disc of wax which he sealed with his thumb. He superscribed the package, quite simply, to Miss Nancy Sylvester, and stood it there on the table against the stem of the candle branch within view of the first person who should enter that room. Next he drew forth his still well-filled purse, and emptied its contents onto the table. One half he replaced. Of the other he made 2 packets, addressing one to Dr. Beamish and the other to Mrs. Dallows. Softly, then he pushed back his chair and rose. He tiptoed to the window and peered down into the shadows where the watchman kept his post, propped in a corner of the padlocked doorway. A sound of snoring came to inform Hollis that, as he had reckoned, the fellow slept. Why should he have troubled to weary himself with a strict and wakeful vigilance? Who could be so mad as to wish to incur all the penalties of evasion from a house that was to be open now in 3 days' time? Hollis went back. He took up his hat and cloak. Then, acting upon a sudden thought, he sought his baldric, and to the empty scabbard that was attached to it, he fitted the slender dress rapier that Buckingham had left behind him. The blade was rather loose in that sheath, but he contrived to jam the hilt. Having passed the baldric over his head and settled it on his shoulder, he blew out the candles, and a moment later he was at the window again. He scarcely made a sound as he straddled the window sill. Then very gently he let himself down, until he hung at full length, his toes not more than 3 feet above the kidney stones of the dark, empty, silent street. A moment he hung there, steadying himself, then loose his hold. He dropped very lightly, and, as he was wearing no spurs, he made practically no noise at all. At once he set off in the direction of Sermon Lane. The watchman, momentarily disturbed by the movement so near at hand, caught a sound of footsteps retreating quickly up the street, but never dreamed of connecting them with anyone from the house he guarded. He settled himself more comfortably in his restful angle, and sank back peacefully into his slumbers. Nevertheless, the evasion of Hollis had not gone as entirely unperceived as he imagined. Slight as had been the noise he made, yet it had reached the window of the room immediately above, and by that window, which was a window of Nancy's room, sat Nancy, driven to that vigil by thoughts that rendered sleep impossible. Her attention aroused by those furtive sounds below, she had leaned far out from the casement and peered down into the darkness. She had heard the soft thud of feet as Hollis dropped to the street, and immediately thereafter the patter of his retreating footsteps. Very faintly she thought she made out at the same time the receding figure of a man, a deeper shadow amid shadows. But however little she may have seen with the eyes of the flesh, she saw all with the eyes of her imagination. She was on the point of crying out, but suddenly checked herself, fearful of rousing the watchman and setting afoot a pursuit which, if successful, might be attended by direst consequences for Hollis. And it was only that same dread that lent her strength to repress the instinctive impulse to call him back and arrest that flight of his. Then she steadied herself. After all, it was possible that she was at fault, that she was a victim of her own imaginings, that her overwrought senses had played a trick upon her. But the doubt was unbearable. She must make sure at once. With trembling, fumbling fingers she kindled a light. Then with a rug wrapped about her over her night rail, she made her way below. Thus she descended the stairs the first time, and when she blamed herself bitterly, in her conviction that she would find things as she feared, for not having earlier taken the step and gone to seek him who remained so obdurately absent. When on the following morning an anxious Mrs. Dallows entered the dining room in fearful quest of her charge, she found her there, at once to her infinite relief and infinite distress. In her night rail, the rug fallen from her bare shoulders, Nancy sat on the daybed under the open window. She was pale and dry-eyed, but with such pain and misery stamped upon her face that the sight of tears would have been comforting by contrast. Beside her was a candlestick in which the single candle had been burnt to the socket. About her the floor was strewn with the sheets of Hollis's letter, which had slipped from her nerveless fingers. That letter had accomplished all that Hollis could have hoped from it. It had quenched completely and finally any lingering embers of her scorn. It had aroused compassion and the old love, and finally despair, for by his own act he was deliberately lost to her again. He was gone irrevocably, as he announced, and by the very manner of his going had made himself an outlaw. Chapter 25 Home. Out of concern for her charge, Mrs. Dallows at once dispatched a watchman for Dr. Beamish, and, when the physician arrived some little while later, she acquainted him with the colonel's evasion and the consequent partially stunned condition in which Miss Sylvester appeared to move. The good doctor, who had come conceive some measure of affection for those two, rooted, perhaps, in a certain pity which their mysterious, but obviously unhappy, relations aroused in him, went at once in deepest distress to seek Miss Sylvester, who had meanwhile returned to her own room above stairs. He found her affliction the more distressing to observe by virtue of her unnatural composure. "This is terrible, my dear," he said as he took her hands. "What can have driven that unhappy man to so unfortunate a course? He must be sought." "You will order search to be made for him," she cried. He sighed and sorrowfully shook his head. "There is no need for me to order that. My duty compels me to make his evasion known. Search for him will follow, but should he be found, it may go very hard with him. There are rigorous penalties." Thus, unavoidably, Dr. Beamish but added a fresh burden to her already surcharged heart. It reduced her to a state of mind bordering upon distraction. She knew not what to desire. Unless he were sought and found, it followed that she would never see him again, whilst if he were found he would have to reckon with the severity of the law, and she could have no assurance that she would see him even then. Out of his anxiety to help her, Dr. Beamish invited her confidence. He conceived here a case of stupid, headstrong, human pride against which two hearts were likely to be broken, and because of that affection which they had come to inspire in him, he would have done all in his power to assist him could he but have obtained an indication of the way. But Miss Sylvester, greatly as it would have eased her sorrow to have confided in him, greatly as she desired to do so, found that no confidence was possible without divulging the thing that Hollis had done, the hideous act by which she came to find herself in this house. A sudden sense of loyalty to him made it impossible for her to publish his infamy. So, rejecting the chance to ease by confidence the burden that she carried, she continued to move, white-faced and listless, under the load of it during the 2 remaining days of her detention. Nor did the doctor come to her again until that third morning, when he was once more accompanied by the examiner, who presented her and her nurse-keeper each with a certificate of health that permitted their free departure. Hollis, she was then informed, had not yet been found, but she knew not whether to rejoice or sorrow in that fact. Bearers were procured for her, the watchman himself volunteering to act as one of them, and the chair in which she had been carried thither, which had been bestowed in the house itself, was brought forth again at her request to carry her away. "But whither are you going?" the doctor questioned her in solicitude. They were standing in the doorway of the house, she with her light hooded mantle of blue taffetas drawn over her white gown, the chair standing in the sunlight, waiting to receive her. "Why, home. Back to my own lodging," she answered simply. "Home," he echoed in amazement. But then this house?" She looked at him as if puzzled by his astonishment. Then she smiled wanly. "This house is not mine. I was here by chance when I was taken ill." The belated revelation of that unsuspected circumstance filled him with a sudden dread on her behalf. Knowing the changes that had come upon that unfortunate city in the month that was overpast, knowing how many were the abandoned houses that stood open now to the winds of heaven, he feared with reason that hers might be one of these, or at least that the odds were all against her finding her home, as she imagined, in the condition in which she had left it. "Where's your lodging?" he asked her. She told him, adding that upon arrival there she would determine her future movements. She ended, that she would seek a while the peace and quiet of the country. Perhaps she would return to London when this visitation was at an end. Perhaps she would not. That was what she said. What she meant was really something very different. The announcement served to increase his dismay on her behalf. It was easier nowadays to project withdrawal into the country than to accomplish it unless one commanded unusual power and wealth. And all those who commanded these things had long since gone. The wholesale flight from London that had taken place, since she was stricken down, had been checked at last by two factors. There was no country town or village for many and many a mile that would receive fugitives from London, out of dread of the infection which these might carry. To repel them, the inhabitants of rural districts had even had recourse to arms, until, partly because of this and to avoid disturbances and bloodshed, partly as a heroic measure against the spread of the plague throughout England, the Lord Mayor had been constrained to suspend the issue of certificates of health, without which no man could depart from London. Those who still remained in the infected area, where the plague was taking now a weekly toll of thousands of lives, must abandon all hope of quitting it until the pestilence should have subsided. Considering now her case and weighing what she had told him, Dr. Beamish perceived that her need of him was far from being at an end. Practical and spiritual assistance might be as necessary to her presently as had lately been a physician's ministrations. "Come," he said abruptly, "I will go with you to your lodging and see you safely bestowed there, that is, if you permit it." "Permit it? Oh, my friend." She held out her hand to him. "Shall I permit you to do me this last kindness? I shall be more grateful than ever I could hope to tell you." He smiled through his owlish spectacles and in silence patted the little hand he held. Then he made shift to lead her forward to her chair. But a duty yet remained her. In the shadows of the hall behind lingered still the kindly Mrs. Dallows, almost tearful at this parting from the sweet charge for whom she conceived so great a kindness. Miss Sylvester ran back to her. "Keep this in memory of one who will never forget her debt to you and never cease to think of you fondly." Into her hand she pressed a clasp of brilliants that she had taken from her bodice, a thing of price far beyond the gold that Hollis had left behind in payment for the nurse's services. Then, as Mrs. Dallows began at one and the same time to thank her and protest against this excessive munificence, Nancy took the kindly woman in her arms and kissed her. Both were in tears when Nancy turned away and ran out to the waiting sedan. The bearers, the watchman, and the fellow he had fetched to assist him, took up the chair and swung away towards Paul's Chains. The little black figure of the doctor strutted beside it, swinging the long red wand that did in the office of a cane, whilst Mrs. Dallows, standing at the door of the house in Knight Rider Street, watched it out of sight through a blur of tears. And within the chair Miss Sylvester, too, was giving way at last to tears. They were the first she had shed since she had received the colonel's letter, which letter was the only thing she carried away with her from that ill-starred house. Lost thus to consciousness of her surroundings, she took no heed of the emptiness and silence of the streets, and of the general air of furtiveness and desolation that hung about the few wayfarers upon whom they chanced and that marked the very houses they were passing. Thus at last they came to Salisbury Court, and to the house that Nancy had indicated. And here at once Dr. Beamish saw that his worst fears were realized. Its door hung wide, and the dust lay thick upon the window panes, two of which were broken. Miss Sylvester, having alighted from her chair, stood looking up, arrested by the unusual aspect of the place, and chilled by a nameless dismay. In awe-stricken wonder, she looked round the court, utterly untenanted, and presenting everywhere the same forsaken aspect. From behind a dusty window of a house across the way, whose door was marked and locked and guarded, an aged yellow face revealed itself, and a pair of eyes that seemed malignant in their furtiveness were watching her. Beyond that ill-omened visage there was in all the court no single sign of life. "What does it mean?" she asked the doctor. Sadly he shook his head. "Can you not guess? Here as elsewhere the plague and the fear of the plague have been busy in your absence." He sighed and added abruptly, "Let's go in." They entered the gloomy vestibule, where dried leaves swept thither by the winds crackled under their feet, and thence they began to ascend a narrow staircase on the baluster, of which there was a mantle of dust. Miss Sylvester called out once or twice as they advanced, but there was no answer to those calls other than the hollow echoes they awoke in that untenanted house. The 3 rooms that had composed her home were situated on the first floor, and as they ascended to the landing, they saw the 3 doors standing open. 2 of the chambers were shuttered, and therefore in darkness, but the drawing room, which directly faced the stairhead, was all in sunlight, and even before they entered it, they had a picture of the devastation wrought there. The furniture was not merely disarranged. It was rudely tumbled, some of it broken, and some was missing altogether. Drawers hung open, as they had been pulled by thieving hands, and that part of their contents which had not been considered worth removing now strewed the floor. A glass cabinet which had stood in one angle lay tumbled forward and shattered into fragments. The secrétaire stood open, its lock broken, its contents rifled, a litter of papers tossed upon and about it. The curtains, torn from their poles, one of which hung broken across a window, had disappeared, as had an Eastern rug that had covered a portion of the floor. Dr. Beamish and the lady stood in silence just within the doorway for a long moment, contemplating that dreadful havoc. Then Miss Sylvester moved swiftly forward to the secrétaire. In an inner drawer which she had left a considerable sum of money, representing most of her immediate resources. That inner drawer had been wrenched open. The money was gone. She turned and looked at Dr. Beamish, her face piteous in its white dismay. She tried to speak, but her lip trembled and her eyes filled again with tears. To have endured so much and to come home to this. The doctor started forward in answer to the pitiful appeal of that glance. He advanced a chair that happened to be whole, and urged her to sit down and rest, as if the rest she needed were merely physical. She obeyed him, and with hands folded in her lap, she sat there looking helplessly around upon the wreckage of her home. What am I to do? Where am I to turn? She asked, and almost at once applied the answer. I had better go from this accursed place at once. I have an old aunt living in Charmouth. I will return to her. She had also, she added, certain moneys in the hands of a banker near Charing Cross. Once she should have withdrawn these, there would be nothing to keep her in London. She rose on the announcement, as if there, and then to act upon it. But the doctor gently restrained her, gently revealed to her the full helplessness of her position, which was more overwhelming even than she supposed. It must be almost certain that the banker she named would temporarily have suspended business and withdrawn himself from a place in which panic and confusion had made an end of commerce for the present. But even if he should still be at his counting house and able at once to supply her demands, such a journey into the country, as she contemplated, was almost utterly impossible. True, the accident of her having had the plague had supplied her with a certificate of health, and in view of this no one could hinder her departure. But considering when she came, it would be with difficulty that out of London she would find anyone to give her shelter. Most likely, indeed, that she would be driven back by sheer necessity, if not by force, before she had gone farther than a day's journey. The realization of this unsuspected thing, that she was doomed to imprisonment in this dreadful city which seemed abandoned alike by God and man, inhabited only by the unfortunate and the unclean, a city of dead and dying, drove her almost to the uttermost limits of despair. For a while she was half stunned and silent. Then speech came from her wild and frantic. What then? What then remains? What am I to do? How live? Oh, God! If only I had perished of the plague. I see that the worst wrong Randall Hollis ever did me was when he saved my miserable life. Hush, hush! What are you saying, child? The doctor set a comforting arm about her shoulders. You are not utterly alone, he assured her gently. I am still here to serve you, my dear, and I am your friend. Forgive me, she begged him. He patted her shoulder. I understand. It is very hard for you, I know, but you must have courage. While we have health and strength, no ill of life is beyond repair. I am old, my dear, and I know. Let us consider now your case. My friend, it is beyond considerations. Who can help me now? I can, for one. That is my intention. But in what way? Why? In several ways at need. But first I can show you how you may help yourself. Help myself. She looked up at him, frowning a little in her mystification. It is in helping others that we best help ourselves, he explained. Who labors but for himself achieves a barren life, is like the unfaithful steward with his talents. Happiness lies in laboring for your neighbor. It is a twofold happiness, for it brings its own reward in the satisfaction of achievement, in the joy of accomplishment, and it brings another in that, bending our thoughts to the needs and afflictions of our fellows, it removes them from the contemplation of the afflictions that are our own. Yes, yes, but how does it lie in my power now to do this? In several ways, my dear. I will tell you of one. By God's mercy and the loving heroism of a fellow creature, you have been cured of the plague, and by that cure you have been rendered what is commonly known as a safe woman, a person immune from infection, who may move without fear among those who suffer from the pestilence. Nurse keepers are very difficult to find, and daily their diminishing numbers grow less equal to the ever-increasing work that this sad visitation provides. Many of them are noble, self-sacrificing women who, without even such guarantees of immunity as you now possess, go heroically among the sufferers, and some of these, alas, are constantly succumbing. He paused, peering at her short-sightedly through his spectacles. She looked up at him in round-eyed amusement. "And you're suggesting that I—" She broke off, a little appalled by the prospect open out to her. "You might do it because you conceive it to be a debt you owe to God and your fellow creatures for your own preservation. Or you might do it so that, in seeking to heal the afflictions of others, you may succeed in healing your own. But, however you did it, it would be a noble act and would surely not go unrewarded." She rose slowly, her brows bent in thought. Then she uttered a little laugh of self-pity. "And unless I do that, what else indeed am I to do?" she asked. "Nay, nay," he made haste to reassure her. "I do not wish to force you into any course against your will. If the task is repugnant to you, and I can well understand that it might be, do not imagine that I shall on that account forsake you. I will not leave you helpless and alone. Be sure of that." She looked at him and smiled a little. "It is repugnant, of course," she confessed frankly. "How should it be otherwise? I have lived soft and self-indulgently from childhood. Therefore, if I do this thing, perhaps it will on that account be more acceptable in the eyes of heaven. As you say, it is a debt I owe." She put out a hand and took his arm. "I am ready, my friend, to set about discharging it." Chapter 26, The Dead Cart. Had you asked Colonel Hollis in afterlife how he had spent the week that followed immediately upon his escape from the house in Knight Rider Street, he could have supplied you with only the vaguest and most incomplete of accounts. His memories were a confused jumble, for which only certain facts detached themselves with any degree of sharpness. The ugly truth, which must be told, is that in all that week he was hardly ever entirely sober. The thing began on the very night, or rather morning, of his evasion, without definite destination, or even aim beyond that of putting as great a distance as possible between himself and Knight Rider Street. Hollis came by way of Carter Lane into Paul's Yard. There he hung a moment hesitating, for a man may well hesitate when all directions are as one to him. Then he struck eastward, down Waddling Street, finally plunging into the labyrinth of narrow alleys to the north of it. Here he might have wandered until broad daylight, but that, lost in the heart of that detail, he was drawn by sounds of revelry to a narrow door, from under which a blade of light was stretched across the cobbles of the street. It was the oddness of those sounds, as incongruous in this plague-stricken London as if they had issued from the bowels of a sepulchre, that gave him pause. On that mean threshold he stood hesitating, peering up at the sign, which he could just discern to be in the shape of a flagon. Once he must have concluded, had other evidences been lacking, that the place was a tavern. Further, he concluded, from his knowledge of the enactment by which all such resorts were close to custom at 9 o'clock, that here a breach of the law was being flagrantly committed, attracted on the one hand by the thought of the oblivion that might be purchased within, repelled on the other by the obviously disreputable character of the place, and by a curious sense of the increased scorn he must evoke in Nancy's mind because she witnessed his weak surrender to so foul a temptation. He ended by deciding to pass on. But even as he turned to do so, the door was suddenly pulled open, and across the street was flung a great shaft of yellow light in which he stood revealed. Two drunken roisterers lurching forth, paused a moment, surprised at the sight of him, arrested there. Then, with drunken inconsequence, they fell upon him, took him each by an arm, and dragged him, weakly resisting, over the threshold of that unclean den, amid shouts of insensate, hilarious welcome from its inhabitants. Hollis stood there in the glare and stench of a half-dozen fish-oil lamps suspended from the beams of the low, grimy ceiling, blinking like an owl, whilst the taverner, vehemently cursing the fools who had left his door agape, made haste to close it again, shutting out as far as possible sight and sound of this transgression of the recent rigorous laws. When presently the colonel's eyes had grown accustomed to the light, he took stock of his surroundings. He found himself in a motley gathering of evil-looking, raffish men and no less evil-looking women. In all, there may have been some 30 of them huddled there together in that comparatively restricted space. The men were rufflers and foice and worse. The women were trolls of various degrees, with raddled cheeks and glittering eyes. Some were maudlin, some hilarious, and some lay helpless and inert as logs. All of them had been drinking to excess, save, perhaps, some 4 or 5 who were gathered about a table apart, snarling over a pack of greasy cards. They were men and women of the underworld, whom circumstances and the fact that no further certificates of health were being issued confined to the plague-ridden city. And, in an excess of the habits of debauch that were usual to them, they took this means of cheating for a brief while the terror in which normally they lived and moved in that stronghold of death. It was a gathering typical of many that Asmodeus might have discovered had he troubled on any of those August nights to lift the roofs of London's houses. Hollis surveyed them with cold disgust, whilst they stared questioningly back at him. They had fallen silent now, all save one who, maudlin, in a corner, persisted in continuing an obscene song with which he had been regaling the company when the colonel entered. "Gad's my life," said Hollis at length, "but that I am told the court has gone to Salisbury, I might suppose myself in Whitehall." The double-edged jibe shook them into an explosion of laughter. They acclaimed him for a wit, and proceeded to pronounce him free of their disreputable company, whilst the 2 topers who had lugged him in from the open dragged him now to one of the tables where room was readily made for him. He yielded to the inevitable. He had a few pieces in his pocket, and he spent one of these on burnt sack before that wild company broke up, and its members crept to their homes, like rats to their burrows, in the pale light of dawn. Thereafter he hired a bed from the vintner, and slept until close upon noon. Having broken his fast upon a dish of salt herrings, he wandered forth again, errant and aimless. He won through a succession of narrow, unclean alleys into the eastern end of Cheapside, and stood there, aghast to survey the change that the month had wrought. In that thoroughfare, usually the busiest in London, he found emptiness and silence, where all had been life and bustle, a continual stream of coaches and chairs of wayfarers on foot and on horseback, of merchants and prentices at the shop doors with their incessant cries of "What d'ye lack?" and clamorous invitations to view the wares and bargains that they offered. The street from end to end was now empty of all but some half-dozen stragglers like himself, and one who with averted head was pushing a wheelbarrow whose grim load was covered by a cloak. Not a coach, not a chair, not a horse in sight, and not a merchant's voice to be heard. Not even a beggar's whine. Here and there shops stood open, but where there were no buyers there was no eagerness to sell. Some few houses he beheld closed, shuttered, and padlocked, each marked with a red cross and guarded by its armed watchman. 1 or 2 others he observed to stand open and derelict. Last of all, but perhaps most awe-inspiring, as being the most eloquent witness to the general desolation, he saw that blades of grass were sprouting between the kidney stones with which the street was paved, so that, but for those lines of houses standing so grim and silent on either side, he could never have supposed himself to be standing in a city thoroughfare. He turned up toward St. Paul's, his steps echoing in the noontide through the empty street, as echo at midnight the steps of some belated reveller. It were improfitable further to follow him in those aimless wanderings in which he spent that day and the days that followed. Once he made an excursion as far as Whitehall, to assure himself that his Grace of Buckingham was, indeed, gone from town, as Dr. Beamish had informed him. He went spurred by the desire to vent a sense of wrong that came to the surface of his sodden, which like oil to the surface of water. But he found the gates of Wallingford House closed and its windows tight-shuttered, as were by then practically all the windows that overlooked that forsaken courtly thoroughfare. Albemarle, he learned from a stray sailor with whom he talked, was still at the cockpit, true to his character. Honest George Monk remained grimly at his post, unmoved by danger. Indeed, going freely abroad in utter contempt of it, engrossed in the charitable task of doing whatever a man in his position could do to mitigate the general suffering. Hollis was tempted to seek him, but the temptation was not very strong upon him, and he withstood it. Such a visit would but waste the time of a man who had no time to waste. Therefore, Albemarle was hardly likely to give him a welcome. His nights were invariably spent at the sign of the Flagon in that dismal alley off Watling Street, into which merest chance had led him in the first instance. What attraction the place could have held for him, he would afterwards have found it difficult to define. There is little doubt that it was just his loneliness that impelled thither his desire for the only society that he knew to be available, a company of human beings in similar case to himself, who sought in the Nepenthes of the wine cup, and in riotous debauch a temporary oblivion of their misery and desolation. Low though he might previously have come, neither was this the resort, nor were the thieves and harlots by whom it was frequented the associates that he would ordinarily have chosen. Fortune, whose sport he had ever been, had flung him among these human derelicts, and there he continued, since the place afforded him the only thing he craved until death should, as he hoped, bring him final peace. The end came abruptly. One night, the seventh that he spent in that lewd haunt of recklessness, he drank more deeply even than his deep habit. As a consequence, when at the host's bidding, he lurched out into the dark alley, the last of all those roisters to depart. His wits were drugged to the point of insensibility. He moved like an automaton, on legs that mechanically performed their function, staggering under him. They bore his swaying body in long lurches down the lane, until he must have looked like some flimsy simulacrum of a man with which the wind made sport. Without apprehension or care of the direction in which he was moving, he came into Watling Street, crossed it, plunged into a narrow alley on the southern side, and reeled blindly onward until his feet struck an obstacle in their unconscious path. He pitched over it, and fell forward heavily upon his face, lacking the will and the strength to rise again. He lay where he had fallen, and sank there into a lethargic sleep. A half-hour passed. It was a half-hour immediately before the dawn. Came a bell tinkling in the distance. Slowly it drew nearer, and a cry repeated at intervals might have been audible and intelligible to Hollis had he been conscious. Soon to these were added other sounds. The melancholy creak of an axle that required greasing, and the slow clank and thud of hooves upon the cobbles. Nearer rang the cry upon the silent night, "Bring out your dead!" The vehicle halted at the mouth of the alley in which the colonel lay, and a man advanced, holding a flaming link above his head, so as to cast its ruddy glare hither and thither to search the dark corners of that byway. This man beheld two bodies stretched upon the ground, the colonel's and the one over which the colonel had stumbled. He shouted something over his shoulder and advanced again. He was followed a moment later by the cart, conducted by his fellow, who walked to the horse's head, pulling at a short pipe, whilst he who held the torch stood there to light the other in his work. His companion stooped and rolled over the first body, then stepped forward and did the same by Colonel Hollis. The colonel's countenance was as livid as that of the corpse that had tripped him up, and he scarcely seemed to breathe. They bestowed no more than a glance upon him with the terrible callous indifference that constant habit will bring to almost any task, and then returned to the other. The man with the link thrust this into a holder attached to the front of the dead cart. Then the two of them on their knees made an examination of the body, or rather of such garments as were upon it. "Not much to trouble over here, Larry," said one. "Aye," growled Larry. "They're sorry enough duds. Come on, Nick. Let's heave her aboard." They rose, took down their hooks, and seizing the body by them, they swung it up into the vehicle. "Fetch the prancer nearer," said Nick, as he turned and stepped toward Hollis. The horse was led forward some few paces, so that the light from the cart now fell more fully upon the colonel's long, supine figure. Nick went down on one knee beside him and uttered a grunt of satisfaction. "This is better." His fellow came to peer over his shoulder. "A gentry cove, damn," he swore with horrible satisfaction. Their practiced ghoulish fingers went swiftly over Hollis, and they chuckled obscenely at sight of the half-dozen gold pieces displayed in Larry's filthy paw. "Not much else," grumbled one after a further inspection. "There's his sword, a rich hilt. Look, Larry. And there's a fine pair of stampers," said Larry, who was already busy about the colonel's feet. "Lend a hand, Nick." They pulled the boots off and made a bundle of them, together with the colonel's hat and cloak. This bundle Larry dropped into a basket that hung behind the cart, whilst Nick remained to strip Hollis of his doublet. Suddenly he paused. "He's still warm, Larry," he said querulously. Larry approached, pulling at his pipe. He growled a lewd oath, expressive of contempt and indifference. "What odds?" he added cynically. "He'll be cold enough or ever we comes to Aldgate." and he laughed as he took the doublet Nick flung to him. The next moment their filthy hooks were in the garments they had left upon Hollis, and they had added him to the terrible load that already half-filled their cart. They backed the vehicle out of the alley, and then trundled on, going eastward, their destination being the pit at Aldgate. Ever and anon in their slow progress, they would halt either at the summons of a watchman or at what they found for themselves. At every halt, they made an addition to their load which they bore away for peremptory burial in that Aldgate plague pit, above which on these hot nights the corpse candles flickered almost constantly to increase the tale of portents, and to scare the credulous into the belief that the place was haunted by the souls of those unfortunates whose bodies lay irreverently tumbled there under the loosely shoveled clay. They were already approaching their destination, and the first light of dawn, pallid, cold, and colorless as a moonstone, was beginning to dispel the darkness, when, be it from the jolting of the cart, or from the flow of blood where one of those foul hooks had scraped his thigh, or yet from preserving nature, quickening his wits that he might save himself from suffocation, the colonel was aroused from his drunken trance. He awakened, thrusting fiercely for air, and seeking to dislodge a heavy mass that lay across his face. The efforts that at first he made were but feeble, as was to be expected from one in his condition, so that he gained no more than brief respites, in each of which, like a drowning man struggling repeatedly to the surface, he gasped a breath of that foul contamination about him. But finding each effort succeeded by a suffocation that became ever more painful, a sort of terror seized upon him, and pulled his senses out of their drunken torpor. He braced himself and heaved more strenuously, until at length he won clear, so far at least, as his head was concerned. He saw the paling stars above, and was able at last to breathe freely and without effort. But the burden which he had succeeded in thrusting from his head now lay across his breast, and the weight of it was troublesome and painful. He put forth a hand, and realizing by the sense of touch that what he grasped was a human arm, he shook it vigorously. Eliciting no response, he began to grow angry. "Afoot there, ye drunken lob," he growled in a thick voice. "Get up, I say. Get up. Oh's my life. Do ye take me for a bed that you put yourself to sleep across me? Garrup," he roared, his anger increasing before that continued lack of response. "Garrup, or I'll—" He ceased abruptly, blinking in the glare of light that suddenly struck across his eyes from the flaming head of the torch, which had been thrust upwards. The cart had come to a standstill, and above the tall side of it, rising into his field of vision, came the two horrible figures of the carters, whom the sound of his voice had brought to mount the wheels of the vehicle. There was something so foul and infernal in those faces, as seen there in the ruddy glare of the torch, that the sight of them brought the colonel a stage nearer to sobriety. He struggled up into a sitting position and looked about him, bewildered, uneasy, furiously endeavoring to conjecture where he might be. In plaintive impatience came the nasal voice of one of those ghouls. "I told you the Gentry Cove was warm, Larry." "Aye. Well, and what now?" quoth the other querulously. "Why, fling him out, o' course." "Bah, let him ride. If he's not stiff yet, he soon will be. What's the odds? And what o' the plague examiner, you fool? Won't he see that it's just a drunken cove who was sleeping off his booze? And what'll he say to us? Here, lend a hand. Let's get him out." But Hollis was no longer in need of their assistance. Their words and what he saw of that grim load of which he was a part had made him realize at last his ghastly situation. The sheer horror of it not only sobered him completely, it lent him a more than ordinary strength. He heaved himself clear and struggled, gasping, to his knees. Thence he gripped the side of the cart, pulled himself to his feet, flung a leg over and leapt down, stumbling as he did so, and sprawling full length upon the ground. By the time he had gathered himself up, the cart was already trundling on again, and the peals of hoarse, obscene laughter from the carters were ringing hideously through the silent street. Hollis fled from the sound, back by the way that he had been carried, and it was not until he had gone some distance, not until foul hilarity of the carters and the clatter of the accursed cart itself had faded out of earshot, that he began to grow conscious of his condition. He was without cloak or hat or doublet or boots. The fact that his sword was gone, as well as the little money that still remained him, seemed to him just then to matter rather less. What chiefly troubled him was that he was cold and dizzy. He shivered every now and then as with an ague. His head was a globe of pain and his senses reeled. Yet he was sober, he assured himself. He could think coherently, and he was able to piece together Not only the thing that had happened to him, but the very manner of its happening. Mechanically, he trudged on, aimlessly now, a man walking in a nightmare. The light grew. The moonstone light of early dawn took on color and began to glow as of the fires of the opal. The sky was invaded and suffused by the saffron heralds of the sun. At last he paused, without knowledge or care where he was. Utterly bereft of strength, he sank presently into the shelter of the doorway of a deserted house, and there fell asleep. When next he awakened, he was lying in the full glare of the sun that was already high in the heavens. He looked about him and found himself in surroundings that were utterly strange to him, so that he could form no notion of whither he had strayed. In mid-street stood a man in a steeple hat dressed in black, leaning upon a red wand and regarding him attentively. "What ails you?" the man asked him, seeing him awake and conscious. Disgruntled, Hollis glared at him. "The sight of you," he snapped and struggled stiffly up. "Naught else." Yet, even as he gained his feet, a giddiness assailed him. He steadied himself a moment against the doorpost, then reeled and sank down again upon the step that had been his couch. For some few seconds he sat there bemused, marveling at his condition. Then, acting on a sudden thought, he tore open the breast of his shirt. "I lied," he shouted wildly. When next he looked up, he was laughing, a ringing, exultant laugh. "I lied. There is something else. Look!" And he pulled his shirt wider apart, so that the man might see what he had found. And that was the last thing that he remembered. On his breast the flower of the plague had blossomed while he slept. Chapter 27, The Pest House. There ensued for Colonel Hollis on some plane other than that of mundane life a period of fevered activity, of dread encounters and terrible combats, of continual strife with a relentless opponent dressed in black and white satin, who wore the countenance as Grace of Buckingham, and who was ever on the point of slaying him, yet, being unmerciful, never slayed. These combats usually took place in a somber panel room by the light of cluster candles and a silver branch, and they had for witness a white-clad, white-faced woman with long blue-green eyes and heavy chestnut hair, who laughed in glee and clapped her hands at each fresh turn of the encounter. Sometimes, however, the battleground was a cherry orchard, sometimes the humble interior of a yeoman's cottage in the neighborhood of Worcester, but the actors were ever the same three. The fact is that Hollis lived in a world of delirium, when at last he awakened one day to sanity, awakened to die, as he thought, when he had taken stock of his surroundings and realized them by the aid of the memories he assembled of his last waking conscious hours. He found himself lying on a pallet, near a window, through which he had a glimpse of foliage and of a strip of indigo sky. Directly overhead were the bare rafters of a roof that knew no ceiling. He turned his head on his pillow and looked away to his left, down a long barn-like room in which stood a half-dozen such pallets as his own, and upon each a sufferer like himself. One or two of them lay inert, as if in death. The others tossed and moaned, whilst one, still more violent, was struggling fiercely with his keepers. It was not a pleasant sight for a man in his condition. So he rolled his head back to its first position, and thus returned to the contemplation of that strip of sky. A great calm settled upon the soul that clung to his fever-wasted body. He understood his situation perfectly. He was stricken with the plague, and he was vouchsafed this interval of consciousness. The consciousness, perhaps, that is a herald of dissolution, in order that he might return thanks to God that at last the sands of his miserable life were run and peace awaited him. The very contemplation of this sufficed to blot out at last the shame that could never in life have left him, the haunting specter of the loathing he must have inspired in her against whom he had so grossly sinned. He remembered that full confession he had left for her, and it was sweet to reflect, before passing out into the cold shadows, that his perusal, revealing all that had gone to make an utter villain of him, showing how fate had placed him between the hammer and the anvil, might mitigate the contempt in which inevitably she must have held him. Tears gathered in his eyes and rolled down his wasted cheeks. They were tears at once of physical weakness and of thanksgiving, rather than of self-pity. Steps were softly approaching his bedside. Someone was leaning over him. He turned his head once more and looked up, and then a great fear took possession of him, so that for a moment his heart seemed to contract. Aloud, he explained to himself that apparition. "I am at my dreams again," he complained in a whisper. At his bedside stood a woman, young and comely in the gray homespun, with the white bands and bib and coif that made up the garb of Puritans. Her face was small and pale and oval. Her eyes were long, of a color between blue and green, very wistful now in their expression. And from under the wings of her coif escaped one or two heavy chestnut curls, to lie upon her white neck. A fine, cool hand sought his own where it lay upon the coverlet. A voice that was full of soft, sad music answered him. "Nay, Randall, you are awake at last. Thank God." And now he saw that those long, wistful eyes were aswim in tears. "Where am I, then?" he asked, in his first real bewilderment since awakening. Almost he began to imagine that he must have dreamt all those things which he had deemed actual memories of a time that had preceded his delirium. "In the pest house in Bunhill Fields," she told him, which only served to increase the confusion in his mind. I can understand that. I have the plague, I know. I remember being stricken with it. But you? How come you here in a pest house?" "There was nowhere else for me to go after I left that house in Knight Rider Street." And very briefly she explained the circumstances. "So Dr. Beamish brought me here. And here I have been by the blessing of Providence," she ended, "tending the poor victims of the plague." "And you tended me? You?" Incredulous amazement lent strength to his enfeebled voice. "Did not you tend me?" she answered him. He made a gesture of repudiation with one of his hands, grown so pale and thin. Then he sighed and smiled contentedly. "God is very good to me, a sinner. As I lay here now, all that I craved was that you, knowing the full truth of my villainy, of the temptation by which I fell, should speak a little word of pity and forgiveness to me to make my dying easier." "You're dying? Why you talk of death?" "Because it comes by the mercy of God. To die of the plague is what I most deserve. I sought it, and it fled before me. Yet in the end I stumbled upon it by chance. All my life is it thus that things have come to me. That which I desire and pursue eludes me. When I cease the pursuit, it turns and takes me unawares. In all things have I been the sport of fortune, even in my dying, as it seems." She would have interrupted, but he hurried on, deceived by his own weakness. "Listen a moment yet, lest I go before I have said what is yet to add to the letter that I left for you. I swear, by my last feeble hope of heaven, that I did not know it was you I was to carry off, else I had gone a hangman before ever I had lent myself to the Duke's business. You believe me? There is no need for your assurances. Randall, I never doubted that. How could I? How could you? Aye, that is true. You could not. So much, at least, would not have been possible, however I might have fallen." Then he looked at her with piteous eyes. "I scarce dare hope that you'll forgive me all. But I do, Randall. I do. I have long since forgiven you. I gave you my forgiveness and my gratitude when I knew what you had done for me, how you risked your life in reparation. If I could forgive you then, can I harbor resentment now that I know all? I do forgive freely, utterly, completely, Randall dear." "Say it again," he implored her. She said it, weeping quietly. "Then I am content. What matter all my unrealized dreams of crown knight errantry, all my high-flown ambitions? To this must I have come in the end. I was a fool not to have taken the quiet good to which I was born. Then might we have been happy, Nan, and neither of us would have felt the need to seek the hollow triumphs of the world." "You talk as if you were to die," she reproved him through her tears. "But you shall get well again. That surely were a crowning folly when I may die so happily." And then the doctor supervened to interrupt them, and to confirm circumstantially her assertion that Hollis was now out of danger. The truth is that what he had done for her when she was plague-stricken, she had now done for him, by unremitting care of him in the endless hours of his delirium, reckless of how she exhausted herself in the effort. She had brought him safely through the valley of the shadow, and already, even as he spoke of dying, deluded by his weakness and the great lassitude that attends exhaustion into believing that already he stood upon the threshold, his recovery was assured. Within less than a week he was afoot, regaining strength, and pronounced clear of the infection. Yet, before they would suffer him to depart into the world again, he must undergo the period of sequestration that the law prescribed, so as to ensure against his conveying infection to others. For this, he was to be removed from the pest house to a neighboring abode of rest and convalescence. When the hour of departure came, he went to take his leave of Nancy. She awaited him on the lawn under the tall old cedars of Lebanon that graced the garden of this farm, which had been converted to the purposes of a hospital. Slimly graceful, she stood before him, whilst in a voice, which he labored to keep steady, he uttered words an irrevocable farewell. It was very far from what she had been expecting, as he might have read in the pale dismay that overspread her countenance. There was a stone seat near at hand there in the shade, and she sank limply down upon this whilst he stood beside her awaiting her dismissal. He was very plainly clad, in garments which he had secretly caused to be procured for him, but which he supposed to be the parting gift of the charitable pest house authorities. She controlled herself to ask him steadily, "What are you going to do? Where shall you go when the month is past?" He smiled and shrugged a little. "I have not yet considered fully," he answered her in actual words, whilst his tone conveyed that he had neither thought nor cared what might follow. Fortune, it might be said, had been kind to him, for Fortune had given him back his life when it was all but lost. But it was the way of Fortune to fool him with gifts when he could no longer profitably use them. "It may be," he added, answering the round stare of her eyes, "that I shall go to France. There is usually work for a soldier there." She lowered her glance, and for a long moment there was silence. Then she spoke again, calmly, almost formally, marshaling the points of an argument that she had well considered. "You remember that day when we talked, you and I, in that house in Knight Rider Street, just after my recovery? When I would have thanked you for my life, you rejected my thanks as you rejected the forgiveness that I offered. You rejected it, persuaded that I was moved only by gratitude for the life you had saved, that I sought by that forgiveness to discharge the debt in which you had placed me." "It was so," he said, "and it is so. It cannot be otherwise." "Can it not? Are you so very sure?" One upward appealing glance she flashed him as she asked the question. "As I am sure that out of your sweet charity you deceive yourself," he answered. "Do I? Let us say that I did. But if you say that I still do, then you are overlooking something. I am no longer in your debt. I have paid it in another and a fuller way. As you saved my life, so have I since saved yours. I thanked God for the merciful chance to do this, since by doing it I could wipe out this debt that seemed to stand between us. We are quits now, Randall. I no longer owe you anything. I have repaid you. Therefore I am no longer under any necessity to be grateful. You cannot deny that. I would not if I could. Then, don't you see? Without indebtedness between us, no longer under any obligation to you. I have given you my forgiveness freely, frankly, and fully. Your offense, after all, was not really against me. It was, he interrupted fiercely. It was against you inasmuch as it was against my own honor. It made me unworthy. Even so, you had my complete forgiveness from the moment that I came to know how cruelly you had been driven. Indeed, I think that I forgave you earlier, much earlier. My heart told me. My senses told me when you attempted to rescue me from the Duke of Buckingham that some such tale of misfortune must lie behind your deed. A little flush came to stain the pallor which his illness had left upon his cheeks. He bowed his head. "I bless you for those words. They will give me courage to face whatever may await me. I shall treasure the memory of them and of your sweetness always. But still you do not believe me," she cried out. "Still you think that behind all there's some dregs of resentment in my heart. No, Nan, I believe you. And yet you will persist in going? What else? You who know all now must see that there is no place for me in England." There was a ready answer leaping to her lips, but she could not utter it. At least, not yet. So again she hung her head, and again there fell a pause, in which she was desperately seeking for another line of attack upon his obstinately proud humility. Arguments to reason failing her, she availed herself of an argument to sentiment. She drew from the bodice of her gown a rubbed and faded tasseled glove. She held it out to him, looking up at him, and he saw that her eyes were wet. "Here is something that belongs to you, at least. Take it, Randall. Take it, since it is all that you will have of me." Almost in hesitancy, he took that little glove, still warm and fragrant from sweet contact with her, and retained also the hand that proffered it. It shall again be a talisman," he said softly, "to keep me worthy as it did not keep me once." Then he bowed over the hand he held and pressed it to his lips. "Goodbye, and God guard you ever, Nan." He would have disengaged his hand, but she clutched it firmly now. "Randall," she cried sharply, desperately driven to woo this man who would not woo her despite her clear invitation. In gentle, sorrowing rebuke, she added, "Can you, then, really think of leaving me again?" His face assumed the pallor of death, and his limbs trembled under him. "What else is possible?" he asked her miserably. "That is a question you had best answer for yourself." "What answer can I supply?" He looked at her, almost fearfully, with those gray eyes that were normally so steady and could be so hard and arrogant. He moistened his lips before resuming. "Should I allow you to gather up these poor shards of my broken life with the hands of pity?" "Pity?" she cried in repudiation. Then, shaking her head a little, "And what if it were so?" she asked. "What then?" "Oh, Randall, if I have pity for you, have you then none for me?" "Pity for you? I thank God you do not stand in need of pity." "Do I not? What else but pitiful can you account my state? I have waited years, with what patience and fortitude I could command, for one to whom I deemed myself to belong, and when at last he arrived, it is only to reject me." He laughed at that, but without any trace of mirth. "Nay, nay," he said, "I am not so easily deceived by your charitable pretense. Confess that out of your pity you but act a part. I see. You think that, having been an actress once, I must be acting ever. Will you believe me? I wonder, when I swear to you that, in all those years of weary waiting, I withstood every temptation that besets my kind, keeping myself spotless against your coming? Will you believe that? And if you believe it, will you cheat me now? Believe it? Oh, God! If I did not, perhaps I could now yield more easily. The gulf between us would be less wide. There is no gulf between us, Randall. It has been bridged and bridged again." He disengaged his hand from her clasp at last. "Oh, why do you try me, Nan?" He cried out like a man in pain. "God knows you cannot need me. What have I to offer? I that am as bankrupt of fortune as of honor. Do women love men for what they bring?" she asked him. "Is that the lesson a mercenary's life has taught you?" "Oh, Randall, you spoke of chance and how it had directed all your life, and yet it seems you have not learned to read its signs. A world lay between us, in which we were lost to each other. Yet chance brought us together again, and if the way of it was evil, yet it was the way of chance. Again we strayed apart. You went from me driven by shame and wounded pride. Yes, pride, Randall, intending the separation to be irrevocable. And again we have come together. Will you weary chance by demanding that it perform this miracle for a third time?" He looked at her steadily now, a man redeemed, driven back into the hard ways of honor by the scourge of all that had befallen him. "If I have been chance's victim all my life, that is no reason why I should help you to be no better. For you there is a great world. There is your art. There is life and joy when this pestilence shall have spent itself. I have nothing to offer you in exchange for all that. Nothing, Nan. My whole estate is just these poor clothes I stand in. If it were otherwise—" "Oh, but why waste words and torturing thought on what might be? We have to face what is. Goodbye." Abruptly, he swung on his heel and left her, so abruptly, indeed, that his departure took her by surprise, found her without a word in which to stay him. As in a dream, she watched the tall, spare, soldierly figure swinging away through the trees toward the avenue. Then at last she half rose, and a little fluttering cry escaped her. "Randall! Randall!" But already he was too far to hear her, even if, had he heard, he would have heeded. Chapter 28, Jesting Fortune. Jesting Fortune had not yet done with Colonel Hollis. A month later, towards the middle of September, without having seen Nancy again, since that, of course, would have been denied him, as it would have nullified his sequestration from infected persons and surroundings, he found himself at liberty to return to the ordinary haunts of man, supplied with certificate of health. He had been considering, in the few days preceding his discharge, whither he should direct his steps once he were made free of the world again, and he had returned to that earlier resolve it is to embark as a hand aboard some vessel bound for France. But a vessel must be found quickly, for Hollis was utterly penniless. He possessed, as he had reminded Nancy, nothing but the comparatively cheap garments in which he stood. He might have obtained a few shillings from the pest house authorities, but his gorge rose at the thought of seeking charity, particularly where it would better become him to bestow it, out of consideration for the benefits received. So within an hour of his discharge, he found himself tramping along the empty streets of the city, bound for distant Wapping. He must go afoot, not only because he lacked the means to go otherwise, but because there were no longer any boats plying for hire at any of the steps along the river, nor any hackney coaches remaining in the streets. More than ever was London become a city of the dead. He trudged on, and everywhere now he beheld great fires of sea coal burning in the streets, a sight that puzzled him at first, until a chance wayfarer informed him that it was done by order of the Lord Mayor and with the approval of his Grace of Albemarle as a means of purifying the tainted air. Yet, although these fires had been burning now for a week, there was no sign yet that they had any such effect as was desired. Indeed, the bill of mortality in that week had been higher than ever before, having risen, as that same wayfarer informed him, to the colossal figure of 8,000. The marvel was, thought Hollis, that any should still be left to die in London. On through that desolate emptiness he tramped in the noontide heat, which still continued as intense as through the months that were past of that exceptional summer, until he came to the Fleet Ditch. Here it was that he bethought him of the Harp in which street where he had lodged, and of its landlord, the friendly Banks, who at some risk to himself had warned him that the messengers of the law were on his heels. It was his utter destitution that now shaped his destiny. But for that, he might not have remembered that in his precipitate departure from that hostelry, he had left some gear behind, including a fine suit of clothes. He could have no personal use for such brave raiment now. The homespun in which he stood was better suited far to one who sought work as a hand aboard a ship. But if he could recover that abandoned gear, it was possible that he might be able to convert it into a modest sum of money to relieve his present necessities. He laughed a little over the notion of fortune being so kind to him as to permit him to find the Harp still open or Banks alive. Still, forlorn hope though it might be, forlorn hopes were the only hopes that remained him. So in the direction of which street he now turned his steps, he found it much as other streets. Not more than one shop and four standing open, and trade in these was idle and stagnant. Proctor's famous ordinary at the sign of the Mitre, the most reputed eating house in London, was closed and shuttered. He regarded this as an evil omen, but he passed on and came presently to stand before the more modest Harp. He could scarcely believe his eyes when he saw its windows clean and open, its door flung wide. He crossed the threshold and turned into the common room on his left. The room was clean swept, its long deal tables were well scoured. But trade was slack, for the place contained a single occupant, a man in an apron who started up from a wooden armchair in which he had been dozing, with an ejaculation of, "As God's my life, a customer." Hollis stared at him, and the man stared back at Hollis. It was Banks, the vintner himself, but a Banks whose paunch had shrunk, whose erstwhile ruddy cheeks had lost their glow and fullness. "Colonel Hollis," he cried, "or is it your ghost, sir? There's more ghosts than living men in this stricken city." "We are both ghosts, I think, Banks," the colonel answered him. "Maybe, but our gullets ain't ghostly, praise the Lord, and there's still some sack left at the Harp. It's the greatest of all electuaries is sack, as Dr. Hodges has it. Sack with plenty of nutmeg, says he, and avoid sweating, and that's how I've kept myself alive. Shall we have a bottle of the medicine, Colonel?" "I'd say yes, with all my heart. But lackaday, I've not the means to pay for the sack." "Pay!" The vintner made a lip. "Sit ye down, Colonel." Banks fetched the wine and poured it. "A plague on the plague is the toast," said he, and they drank it. "Slife, Colonel, but I am glad to see you alive. I feared the worst for you. Yet you contrived to keep yourself safe, avoiding not only the plague, but them pestilential fellows that was after you." Without waiting for a reply, he dropped his voice to add, "Ye'll have heard how Danvers was took, and how he broke away and won free. Good luck to him. But all that is a dream by now, that conspiracy business, and no one bothers much about it. Not even the government. There's other things to engage them, and not much government left neither. But of yourself now, Colonel? My tale's soon told. I've not fared quite as well as you suppose. I've had the plague." "The devil you have, and ye've won through." Banks regarded him with a new respect. "Well, you were born lucky, sir." "You give me news," said the colonel. "There isn't many escapes," the vintner assured him ruefully. "And you having had the pestilence makes you a safe man. Ye can come and go as ye please without uneasiness. and your sack as an electuary is wasted on me. But if I'm safe, I'm also penniless, which is what's brought me here, to see if some gear of mine is still in your possession, that I may melt it into shillings. I have it all safe, Banks assured him. A brave suit, with boots and a hat, a baldric, and some other odds and ends. They're above stairs, waiting for you when you please. But what may you be thinking of doing, Colonel, if I may make so bold as to ask? Hollis told him of his notion of sailing as a hand aboard a vessel bound for France. The vintner pursed his lips and sadly shook his head, regarding his guest a while from under bent brows. Why, sir, he said, there's no French shipping and no ships bound for France at Wapping, and mighty few ships of any kind. The plague has put an end to all that. The port of London is as empty as Proctor's yonder. There's not a foreign ship put into it, nor an English one go out of it, for she wouldn't be given harbor anywhere for fear of the infection. The colonel's face lengthened in dismay. This, he thought, was the last blow of his malignant fortune. I shall have to go to Portsmouth, then, he announced gloomily. God knows how I shall get there. Ye never will, for Portsmouth won't have ye, nor any other town in England neither, coming as ye do from London. I tell you, sir, the country's all crazed with feared plague. But I've a certificate of health. Ye'd need to have it backed by a minister of state, or ever Portsmouth would let you inside her gates. Hollis looked at him blankly for a moment, then expressed his bitterness in a laugh. In that case, I don't know what remains. You don't need a drawer these days, I suppose? The vintner was frowning thoughtfully, considering the first of those two questions. Why, you say ye're a safe man. You'll not have seen his grace of Albemarle's proclamation asking for safe men. Asking for safe men? To what end? Nay, the proclamation don't say. You'll find that out in Whitehall, maybe, but there's a service of some kind his grace has to offer to them as is safe. Things being like this with you. Now, you might think it worthwhile to ask. It might be something for ye, for the present at least. It might, said Hollis. And apparently it's that or nothing. He'll be needing scavengers, likely, or drivers for the dead cart. Nay, it'll be something better than that, said Banks, taking him literally. Hollis rose. Whatever it may be, when a man is faced with starvation, he had best realize that pride won't fill an empty belly. No more it will, Banks agreed, eyeing the colonel's uncouth garments. But if you're thinking of paying a visit to Whitehall, you'd be wise to put on that other suit that's above stairs. You'll never get past the lackeys in that livery. So you see issuing presently from the sign of the Harp a Colonel Hollis, very different from the Colonel Hollis who had entered it an hour earlier, in a dark blue suit of camlet enlivened by a little gold lace, black Spanish boots, and a black beaver set off by a heavy plume of royal blue, without a sword, it is true, but swinging a long cane. He presented a figure rarely seen just then in London streets. Perhaps because of that, his appearance at the cockpit made the few remaining and more or less idle ushers bestir themselves to announce him. He waited but a moment in the empty anteroom where 3 months ago he had overheard Mr. Pepys of the Navy Office proclaiming England's need of practiced soldiers. The usher who went to announce him returned almost at once to conduct him into that pleasant chamber overlooking the park, where his Grace of Albemarle acted today as deputy for the pleasure-loving libertine prince who had forsaken his stricken capital. The Duke heaved himself up as the colonel entered. "So you're come at last, Randall," was his astounding greeting. "On my life, you've taken your own time in answering my letter. I concluded long since that the plague had carried you off." "Your letter?" said Hollis, and he stared blankly at the Duke as he clasped the proffered hand. "My letter? Yes. You had it? The letter that I sent you nigh upon a month ago to the Paul's Head?" "Nay," said Hollis, "I had no letter." But Albemarle looked almost as if he did not believe him. "The landlady there kept it for you. She said, I think, that you were absent at the time, but would be back in a day or two, and that you should have the letter at once on your return." "A month ago, do you say? But it is 2 months and more since I left the Paul's Head. Will you tell me?" "Oh, wait. My messenger shall speak for himself on this." And he strode away to the bell rope. But Hollis checked him. Nay, he cried with a wry smile. "There's not the need. I think I understand. Mrs. Quinn has been riding her malice on a loose rein. Your messenger would, no doubt, announced whence he came, and Mrs. Quinn, fearing that the news might be to my advantage, acted so as to prevent his making further search for me. Evidently the plague has spared that plaguey woman. What's this? The Duke's heavy face empurpled. Do you charge her with suppressing a communication from an office of state? By heaven, if she's still alive, I'll have her jailed for it. Let be, said Hollis, seizing him by the arm. Devil take the woman. Tell me of the letter. You'll never mean that you had found employment for me. After all, you seem incredulous, Randall. Did you doubt my zeal for you? Oh, not your zeal, but the possibility of your helping one who was in my case. Aye. But as to that, why, Buckingham improved it when he stood surety for your loyalty before the justices. I heard of that, and when the chance came, the chance of this Bombay command that already I had earlier intended for you. The Bombay command? Hollis began to wonder, did he dream? But I thought that it had been required by Buckingham for a friend of his own, Sir Henry Stanhope. Yes, so it had, and Stanhope sailed for the Indies with the commission. But it seems that when he did so, he already carried the seeds of the plague within him, for he died of it on the voyage. It was a providence that he did, poor devil, for he was no more fitted for the command than to be Archbishop of Canterbury. I wrote to you at once asking you to seek me here, and I waited a fortnight to hear from you. As you made no sign, I concluded that either you were stricken with the plague or no longer desired the office, and I proceeded to appoint another gentleman of promise. Hollis folded the pinions of his soaring hopes and let himself fall back into his despondency. He uttered a groan. But that's not the end. Albemarle checked him. No sooner had I appointed this other than he, too, fell sick of the plague and died a week ago. I have already found another suitable man. No easy matter in these days, and I had resolved to appoint him tomorrow to the vacant office. But if you're not afraid that the plague is bound up with this commission, it's at your disposal, and it shall be made out to you at once. Hollis was gasping for breath. You mean that I am to have the command after all? It was incredible. He dared not believe it. That is what I have said. The commission is... Albemarle broke off suddenly and fell back before him. What ails you, man? You're white as a ghost. You're not ill. And he lugged out a handkerchief that flung a reek of myrrh and ginger on the air, leaving Hollis no single doubt of the thing his grace was fearing. Albemarle imagined that the plague which, as he had said, seemed bound up with this commission, was already besetting the man upon whom he now proposed to bestow it. The humor of it took Hollis sharply, and his laugh rang out further to startle the Duke. There's no need for lecturers against me, he assured his grace. I am certified in health and carry no infection. I left Bunhill Fields this morning. What? Albemarle was astounded. Do you mean you had the plague? That is the whole reason of my being here. I am a safe man now, and I came in answer to your proclamation asking for safe men. Albemarle continued to stare at him in deepening amazement. So that is what brought you, he said at last, when full understanding came to him. But for that I certainly should never have come. Gad, said Albemarle, and he repeated the ejaculation with a laugh, for he found the situation curious enough to be amusing. Gad, the ways of chance. Chance, echoed Hollis, suddenly very sober, realizing how this sudden, unexpected turn of fortunes would change the whole complexion of his life. Almost it seems that chance has stood my friend at last, though it has waited until I had touched the very bottom of misfortune. But for your proclamation, and but for Mrs. Quinn, too, I should have been fortune's fool again over the matter of this commission. It would have been here waiting for me, and I should never have known. The very malice by which Mrs. Quinn sought to do me disservice has turned to my benefit. For had she told your messenger the truth, that I had vanished, and that she had no knowledge of my whereabouts, you would never have traced me just then, and you would never have waited that fortnight. Thus all might have been changed. He paused, lost in a wonder that Albemarle did not share. Maybe, said his grace briskly. But what matters now is that you are here, and that the command is yours if you still wish it. There is not even the fear of the plague to deter you, since you are a safe man now. It is an important office, as I told you, and so that you discharge its duties, as I know you will, it may prove but a stepping stone to greater things. What do you say? Say, cried Hollis, his cheeks flushed, his gray eyes gleaming. Why? I give you thanks with all my heart. Then you accept it. Good, for I believe you to be the very man for the office. Albemarle stepped to his writing table, selected from among some document a parchment bearing a heavy seal, sat down, took up a pen, and wrote briskly for a few seconds. He dusted the writing with pounce and proffered the document. Here, then, is your commission. How soon can you sail? In a month, said Hollis promptly. A month? Albemarle was taken aback. He frowned. Why, man, you should be ready in a week. Myself, I could be ready in a day. But I mean to take this newfound tide of fortune at the flood and... But Albemarle interrupted him impatiently. Don't you realize, man, the time that has been already lost? For 4 months now this office has stood vacant, which means that there's a very competent lieutenant in charge. Let him continue yet a while. Once I am there, I'll speedily make up for lost time. That I can promise you. You see, it may be that I shall have a companion, who cannot possibly be ready in less than a month. With an odd, reckless trust in the continuance of fortune's favor now, he boldly added, You have said that I am the very man for the office. The government can wait a month, or you can appoint someone less likely to serve it as efficiently. Albemarle smiled at him grimly across the table. You're very full of surprises today, Master Randall, and this one baffles me. Shall I explain it? It would be a condescension. Hollis poured out his tale, and Albemarle gave him a sympathetic hearing. When he had done, the Duke sighed and turned aside before replying, to examine the pages of a notebook at his elbow. Well, he said at length, having consulted an entry. The English lass is fitting at Portsmouth for the voyage, and should be ready, I am informed, in 2 weeks from now. But there are ever delays at present, and it is odds that in no case would she be ready in less than 3 weeks. I'll see to it that she is not ready under a month. Impetuously, the colonel held out both hands to the Duke. What a friend you are, he cried. Albemarle wrung them hard. You're damnably like your father, God rest him, said he. Then, almost brusquely, away with you now and good luck to you. I'll not ask you to stay to see her grace at present, since you're pressed. You shall kiss her hands before you sail. Be off. Hollis took his leave. At the door he suddenly checked, and, turning, displayed a rueful countenance. Although I have the king's commission in my pocket and hold an important office in the service, I haven't a shilling in the world, he said. Not a shilling. Albemarle responded instantly by producing a purse from which he counted 20 pounds. There was no sign of parsimonious reluctance about his offer now. As a loan, of course, said Hollis, gathering up the yellow coins. No, Albemarle corrected him. An advance. Take no further thought for it. The Treasury shall refund me the money at once. Chapter 29, The Miracle. Away from Whitehall, where the ground was green with thriving grass, went Colonel Hollis at speed. He set his face towards Islington once more and swung along with great strides, carrying in his breast a heart more blithe than he had known for many a year. Blind and deaf to all about him, his mind sped ahead of his limbs to the goal for which he made. Thus, until a sudden awful dread assailed him. Fortune had fooled and cheated him so often that it was impossible he should long continue in this newborn trust in her favor. It was, after all, for weeks since he had seen Nancy, and those in that house of rest where he had spent the period of his sequestration could tell him nothing of her, since they held no direct intercourse with those who had their being in the pest houses. In a month much may betide. Evil might have befallen her, or she might have departed thence. To soothe the latter dread came the recollection that any such departure would have been impossible until she, too, had undergone the prescribed period of disinfection. But the former dread was not so easily to be allayed. It would be so entirely of a piece with all his history that, now that apparently he held the earnest of fortune in his hands, he should make the discovery that this had reached him too late, that, even as she bestowed with the one hand, so with the other did fortune rob him. You conceive, then, the dread anxiety in which he came, breathless, hot, and weary from the speed he had made, to the open fields and at last to the stout, spiked gates of that pleasant homestead that had been put to the uses of a lazarette. Here a stern and surly guardian denied him passage. You cannot enter, sir. What do you seek? Happiness, my friend. said the colonel, completing the other's conviction that he was mad. But mad or sane, there was a masterful air about him now. He bristled with the old amiable arrogance that of late had been overlaid by despondency and lassitude of soul, and his demand that the gate should be unbarred for him held an authority that was not lightly to be denied. "You understand, sir," the gatekeeper asked him, "that once you enter here, you may not go back once you come for 28 days at least?" "I understand," said Hollis, "and I come prepared to pay the price. So, in God's name, open, friend." The gatekeeper shrugged. "Eerie warned," he said, and raised the bar, thus removing, as he thought, all obstacles that kept a fool from his folly. Colonel Hollis entered. The gates clashed behind him, and he took his way briskly, almost at a run, down the long avenue in the dappled shade of the beech trees and elms that bordered it, making straight for the nearest of the red brick outhouses, which was the one which he himself had occupied during his sickness. A broadly built, elderly woman perceived his approach from the doorway, and, after staring at him a moment in surprise and consternation, started forward to meet him, calling to him to stand. But he came on heedless and breathless until they were face to face. "How came you in, you foolish man?" she cried. "You don't know me, Mrs. Barlow?" he asked her, startled anew by that pleasant, familiar address. She stared at him again, and then, under the finery and vigor investing him and rendering him almost unrecognizable to eyes that remembered only the haggard, meanly clad fellow of a month ago, she discovered him. "Save us. It's Colonel Hollis." And almost without pause she went on in a voice of distress. "But you were to have left the house of rest today. Whatever can have brought you back here to undo all again? Nay, not to undo. To do, Mrs. Barlow, by God's help. But ye've a singular good memory, to remember that I should be leaving today." She shook her head and smiled with a touch of sadness. "'Twasn't me that remembered, sir. It was Miss Sylvester." And again she shook her head. "She's here, then." "Ha! She is well. Well enough? Poor dear. But oh, so mortal sad. She's yonder, resting, under the cedars, a place she's haunted this past month." He swung aside, and without more than a hurriedly flung word of thanks or excuse, he was gone swiftly across the lawn, towards that cluster of cedars, amid whose gnarled old trunks he could discern the flutter of a gray gown. She had haunted the spot this month past, Mrs. Barlow had said, and it was the spot where they had spoken their farewells. Ah, surely fortune would not trick him this time. Not again, surely, would she dash away the cup from his very lips, as so often she had done, as he drew nearer over the soft, yielding turf that deadened all sound of his steps. He saw her sitting on that stone seat where a month ago he had left her in the conviction that he was never to behold her again with the eyes of flesh. Her shoulders were turned towards him, but even so he perceived in her attitude something of the listlessness by which he was possessed. He paused, his pulses throbbing, paused instinctively, fearing now to startle her, as startle her he must, however he approached. He stood arrested there, breathless, at a loss, and then, as if she sensed his presence, she slowly turned and looked behind her, a long while she stared, startled, white-faced. "Randall!" She was on her feet, confronting him. He plunged forward. "Oh, Randall, why have you come here? You should have gone today." "I went, and I have returned, Nan," he told her, standing there beside her now. "You have returned." She looked him over more attentively now, and observed the brave suit of dark blue camlet that so well became his tall, spare frame, and the fine Spanish boots that were now overlaid with dust. "You have returned," she said again. "Nan," he said, "a miracle has happened." And from his breast he pulled that parchment with its great seal. "A month ago I was a beggar. Today I am Colonel Hollis in something more than name, commanding something more than a mere regiment. I have come back, Nan, because at last I can offer you something in exchange for all that you will sacrifice in taking me." She sank down slowly, weakly, to the seat, he standing over her, until they were in the same attitude of a month ago. But how different now was all else. She leaned her elbows on her knees a moment, pressing her hands to her throbbing temples. "It is real, this? It is true?" "True?" she asked aloud, though clearly not of him. And then she sat back again and looked up into his face. It is not very much, perhaps, when all is said, though it seems much to me today. And with you beside me, I shall know how to make it more. Still, such as it is, I offer it." And he tossed the parchment down into her lap. She looked at the white cylinder without touching it, and then at him again, and a little smile crept about the corners of her sweet mouth and trembled there. Into her mind there leapt the memory of the big boast of conquest for her sake, with which he had set out in the long ago. "Is this the world you promised me, Randall?" she asked him, and his heart bounded at the old rallying note, which laid his last doubt to rest. "As much of it as I can contrive to get," said he. "Then it will be enough for me," she answered, and there was no raillery in her voice now, only an infinite tenderness. She rose, and, standing there close before him, held out the parchment still unfolded. "But you haven't looked," he protested. "What need to look? It is your kingdom, you have told me, and I'll share your kingdom whatever it may be. It is situated in the Indies, in Bombay," said he with a certain diffidence. She considered. "I always had a thirst for travel," she said deliberately. He felt that it was due to her that he should explain the nature of this appointment and how he came by it. To that explanation he proceeded. Before he had reached the end, she was in tears. Why, what now?" he cried in dismay. "Does your heart misgive you?" "Misgive me? Oh, Randall, how can you think that? I weep for thankfulness. I have spent a month of such hopeless anguish, and now—" He put an arm about her shoulder and drew her head down onto his breast. "My dear," he murmured. He sighed, and held her thus in a silence that was like a prayer, until at length she raised her face. "Do you know, Randall, that it is more years than I care to think of since last you kissed me, and then you vexed me by stealing what is now yours to take?" He was a little awed, but after all, with all his faults, he was never one to yield to fear. They were married on the morrow, and their honeymoon was spent in that sequestration that the law exacted. Certified clear of infection at last, they were permitted to go forth to garner the honors that fortune had stored up for Randall Hollis, to make amends for all that he had earlier suffered at her hands. The end.